She was a nurse who counted her Metropass transfers twice and still came up short most months. He was the kind of man whose name got whispered in City Hall before board meetings and stopped being whispered immediately after. Their worlds had no business intersecting. But at 2:17 on a Wednesday morning in the underground parking garage of Mount Sinai Hospital, a small girl in a yellow rain jacket slammed directly into Celia Doyle's legs. And fate, it seemed, had entirely different plans. Celia Doyle was 27 years old. She worked nights in the emergency department, the kind of shift nobody wanted, the one that paid slightly better and smelled of burnt coffee and hand sanitizer until the smell stopped registering entirely. She lived in a one-bedroom in Parkdale she shared with her younger brother Rex, a first-year student at U of T who ate her leftovers without asking and left his textbooks across the kitchen table. She was saving, slowly, badly, to help Rex finish his degree without drowning in debt. She had $340 in her savings account and a bruise on her elbow from a patient's IV pole. She was exactly nobody. The girl was alone. That was the first thing Celia registered. The parking garage was empty at that hour, except for the flicker of a fluorescent strip over P2 that had been threatening to die since November, and the echo of the girl's sneakers on concrete. She was maybe 8 years old, dark-haired, and she was clutching a worn stuffed rabbit by one ear with the specific grip of a child who had decided that rabbit was the last solid thing in the world. "Hey!" Celia crouched down, her scrub still damp from a spilled saline bag. "Hey, sweetheart, you lost?" The girl didn't answer. She stared at Celia with enormous grey eyes and made no sound at all. Celia felt the hairs lift on the back of her neck half a second before she heard the footsteps. Two men coming fast from the stairwell. Leather jackets, wrong shoes for a hospital. One of them already had his hand inside his jacket. And a nurse who had spent 4 years in a downtown ER knew exactly what that meant. She didn't stop to calculate. She grabbed the girl, yanked open the back door of her rusted-out Honda Civic, shoved her onto the floor of the back seat, pulled her duffel bag over her. Then Celia got in front, locked the doors, and lay flat across the seats. The bang was deafening in the concrete echo chamber. The back window exploded inward. She heard the girl make a sound, not a word, not a scream, just a single sharp breath like a flinch made audible. Then other footsteps, more of them, a scuffle, shouting that wasn't directed at her, glass crunching underfoot. Then silence. Then a knock on her window, two short and one long, deliberate, patient. Celia sat up. A man in a dark suit stood outside her car, hands visible, expression carefully neutral. He was not one of the men in leather jackets. Behind him, two others in matching tactical vests had the attackers face down on concrete. "Ma'am." The suited man's voice was muffled through the glass. "My name is Harker. I work for Mr. Brandt. We've been looking for his daughter." His daughter. Celia looked at the girl in the back seat. The girl had surfaced from under the duffel bag and was sitting up, rabbit clutched to her chest, watching the suited man with no expression at all. "That's your dad's person?" Celia asked her. The girl gave one slow nod. Celia unlocked the door. The moment it opened, another man appeared. Not from the stairwell, but from the ramp, arriving at a half-run that he slowed deliberately when he reached the car. He was tall, wearing a coat that cost more than 2 of Celia's monthly rents. His dark hair was slightly disordered, the only disorderly thing about him, and his face was the face of a man accustomed to having everything under control and furious that for a moment he had not. He opened the back door. The little girl, his daughter, launched herself at him. Hugo Brandt held her with both arms, bearing, he said her name, Kira, just that, one word, rough at the edges. Then he straightened, still holding her, and looked at Celia. His eyes were dark, the color of coffee gone cold. They moved from her face to her arm, where blood had soaked through her sleeve in a stripe the width of 2 fingers. "You're hit," he said. "It's a graze," Celia said. "I've dressed worse on a Tuesday." He looked at her for one long moment she couldn't read. Then, very quietly, "Get in my car." She woke up in a house that didn't make sense. Not a hospital. Celia knew hospitals the way she knew her own breathing. She would have recognized the sounds and smells the moment consciousness arrived. This was something else. The ceiling was plaster medallion, painted the white of old pearls. The sheets had been laundered 1,000 times into perfection. The light filtering through the curtains was the soft grey of a Toronto November morning, and there were fresh white ranunculus on the bedside table. Not from a hospital gift shop. Her arm had been properly dressed. Neat, professional, better than she'd have done herself. She sat up and looked at her left hand. There was a ring on it. Not a small ring, not a subtle ring. A cushion-cut stone in a plain platinum band, the kind of ring that had its own insurance policy. It sat on her finger like it had always been there. It was breathtaking. It made Celia's stomach drop through the mattress. "Good morning." The voice came from a wing-back chair half in shadow near the fireplace. Hugo Brandt stood when she looked at him, buttoning his jacket, a different suit than the night before, charcoal this time, perfectly pressed. He'd been in that chair for hours, she realized, or hadn't slept at all. "Where am I?" she asked. "Rosedale," he said. "My home." "Why is there a ring on my finger?" Hugo crossed the room. He stood at the foot of the bed with the quality of stillness that Celia would later come to understand meant he was choosing every word in advance. "You were photographed," he said, "by a bystander in the garage. My daughter holding your hand, you bleeding." He paused. "The image was posted by 6:30 this morning. 3 outlets picked it up by 8. By the time you woke up, the question of who you were had already been asked. And if the answer is a nurse from Parkdale who happened to be in the wrong place, the people who sent those men last night will find you before the week is out. You're a witness, a liability, leverage." His voice was even, not cold, simply stating geography. "But if the answer is something else—" "If the answer is that I'm your wife," Celia said. He met her eyes without flinching. "The people I deal with operate by a code that is brutal and very specific. A man's wife is untouchable, not out of sentiment, out of consequence. Touching her starts a war, no one wins." Celia looked at the ring. "You announced this already." "I released a statement at 7 this morning. We have been seeing each other privately for several months. We married last week quietly, at the request of my daughter." He paused fractionally on those last words, which is not entirely untrue. "You did this while I was unconscious," she said. "I did this," he agreed, "to keep you alive." There was something in his voice that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite not one. "I can offer you an alternative, a new identity. Relocation somewhere they won't look, but you would not be able to contact your brother. You would not be able to practice nursing under your own name. You would start over, entirely." Celia thought of Rex. Rex who called her when he had a bad day. Rex who needed her help to make it through to spring. Or, Hugo said, "You stay here, you play the role, you live safely in comfort for as long as it takes." She was about to say no. She had the word assembled and ready. Then the door opened. Kira stood in the hallway in pajamas printed with small foxes, rabbit under one arm. She looked at her father. Then she looked at Celia, and without any apparent decision-making process, she crossed the room, climbed up onto the bed and settled herself against Celia's good side as though she had been doing it her whole life. She didn't say anything. She never said anything. But she was warm and solid, and she smelled of the same tear-free shampoo as every 8-year-old Celia had ever treated in the ER. And she was trembling, faintly, the way a child trembles when they've been frightened and are pretending not to be anymore. Celia looked at Hugo over the top of Kira's head. Hugo looked back with an expression stripped of the composure he'd worn all morning. "Celia, I have conditions," she said. The mansion's housekeeper, Mrs. Bellamy, was a compact woman in her 60s who moved through the house with the efficient silence of someone who had learned that the less she was noticed, the better everyone's day went. She showed Celia a dressing room full of clothing organized by color and occasion, with the same brisk pragmatism she applied to everything. "Mr. Brandt had a stylist come yesterday afternoon," Mrs. Bellamy said. "He wasn't certain of your taste." "He bought all of this yesterday afternoon," Celia said, touching the sleeve of a burgundy cashmere sweater. "He did. While I was unconscious." "He is thorough," Mrs. Bellamy said without inflection. "Dinner is at 7. There are guests tonight. You'll want the navy dress." The guests were Hugo's lieutenants, 8 of them, ranging from mid-30s to late 60s, assembled around a dining table long enough to host a small gala. They were dressed well and watchful, and they looked at Celia the way people look at things they are trying to find the flaw in. Celia sat at Hugo's right hand. He was composed, authoritative, the kind of man a table full of dangerous people went quieter around without being told to. Throughout the meal, he touched her the way a man in love touches his wife, his hand resting on the back of her chair, his thumb brushing her shoulder once when the conversation shifted. Each gesture was precise and deliberately visible. Celia tried to match it. She smiled at his dry, understated jokes. She let her knee rest against his under the table. It felt like performing surgery with someone else's hands. The trouble came over dessert. A man named Clement, 50s, silver-templed, with eyes that were always doing quiet arithmetic, leaned forward and said pleasantly, "It's quite the story, isn't it? The nurse from Parkdale, right place, right time." He smiled at Celia with the smile of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "Tell me, what made you throw yourself in front of the situation? Most people would have simply driven away." The table went quiet in the way tables go quiet when everyone is still pretending to eat, but has actually stopped. Celia set down her spoon. She looked at Clement with the same steady calm she used when a patient's family member was about to become difficult in her ER. "I've been making the choice to run toward the problem for 4 years," she said. "At some point it stops feeling like a choice." She held his gaze. "I saw a little girl who was alone and frightened. I didn't have time to calculate the rest." Clement's smile didn't waver. "Admirable, and now you've landed rather comfortably, given the circumstances." "Clement." Hugo's voice was quiet. One word, the temperature in the room dropped. Clement looked at him. "My wife just told you something honest," Hugo said. "The appropriate response is not a veiled insult." His eyes were completely still. "Apologize." The pause that followed lasted exactly long enough to make clear that Clement was choosing to comply rather than being unable to resist. "My apologies, Mrs. Brandt," he said. "I spoke carelessly." Celia nodded once and picked up her spoon. Under the table, Hugo's hand covered hers. His thumb traced a slow line across her knuckles. When she glanced sideways at him, he was speaking to the man on his left, perfectly composed, but his hand didn't move. The Harbourfront Gala was the kind of evening where the city's most powerful people wore their charity faces over their usual ones, and everyone pretended the reason they were all in the same room was the children's hospital wing. Hugo had attended for a decade. It was, he explained in the armoured car on the way there, the one evening a year where the rules of engagement were formally suspended. "And if someone wants to conduct the other kind of business?" Celia asked. He looked at her. "They don't, that's the rule." The ballroom was spectacular in a way that made Celia feel like she'd walked into a parallel version of the city she knew. She wore a deep green gown that Mrs. Bellamy had chosen, long-sleeved, and she felt, not entirely comfortably, like someone she'd never met before. Hugo kept his hand at the small of her back. Heads turned when they entered. She heard her new name passed around the room in murmurs. They danced once, a waltz, because of course. Hugo danced the way he did everything, deliberately precisely, giving nothing away except capability. "Half the room is watching us," she said. "They want to see if you're real," he said, "or a liability." "Which am I?" He looked at her then, directly, and for a moment the composure slipped just enough to show something underneath it. "That's what I'm still determining," he said. "Honest," she said. "Always," he said, "when it matters." Hugo was pulled away an hour in. Clement found him, murmured something urgent, and Hugo squeezed Celia's hand once. "Stay at the bar," he said. "Don't leave." Celia stayed at the bar. She drank sparkling water and watched the room the way she watched a waiting area for signs of things about to go wrong. She'd gotten very good at that particular skill. She saw it at 18 minutes in. A server was cutting through the crowd from the east side. Well-timed, angled, not looking at his tray. Looking at the corridor where Hugo had disappeared. His right hand kept dropping below his serving cloth in a way that reminded Celia of exactly one thing, and that thing had happened in a parking garage 3 weeks ago. She looked at the tower of champagne glasses, stacked at the end of the bartender's station. She picked up a heavy crystal highball glass and threw it sideways into the pyramid. The crash was magnificent. Every head in the room turned. The music lurched to a stop. Hugo in the corridor spun at the sound. The server hesitated. Half a second, a full second, and in that second Hugo saw him, and the server saw that Hugo saw him. And everything moved very quickly after that. 2 of Hugo's security materialized from different directions at once. The man was taken down before he reached the corridor door. Celia stood at the bar, heart hammering hard against her ribs. Hugo crossed the room to her in 12 steps. "The server," she said, "east side. He was going for you." He looked at the quiet commotion being managed near the east wall, then back at Celia. Something shifted in his face she hadn't seen before. Not surprise exactly, something more like recognition. "We need to go," he said. But when they reached the main doors, they found something worse than an assassin. RCMP vehicles in the side lot, tactical teams, moving with the precision of advance information, security positions, access points, timing, information that came from inside. "Clement," Celia said. But his jaw was a wall. They left through the kitchen. The safe house was above a dry cleaner's in Leslieville. Bare walls, a cot, canned goods, a first aid kit under the sink. The kind of apartment that existed purely to be invisible. Hugo sat on the edge of a folding table and worked his phone, sorting through who was still clean, who Clement might have reached, who could be trusted with Kira's location. Kira was at the mansion. Clement ran the guard rotations at the mansion. The realization hit them both at the same moment. "She's there," Celia said. "I know. His voice was stripped of everything, all the composure, all the control, just the sound of a father who had not seen it coming. Celia grabbed his arm. Who doesn't Clement control? Who's outside the system entirely? Hugo was quiet for a long moment. Then my brother. Where? Hamilton, he runs independently. We haven't spoken in 3 years. Then we drive, Celia said. She was already pulling on her coat. Hugo's brother Radek was not what Celia had imagined. A warehouse in Hamilton's industrial district, heated and lit, where a dozen men who appeared to have been built specifically for unpleasant situations were playing cards and waiting to be pointed at something. Radek was wiry and dark-eyed, and he looked at Hugo with the expression of a man who had been both very hurt and very right in his life. You have a problem, Radek said, looking at the green gown visible beneath Celia's coat, the first aid tape on her arm. Kira, Hugo said. That was all he needed to say. Radek put down his cards. They came back to the Rosedale mansion in the grey hour before dawn, 4 vehicles with their lights off, moving through the service gate that Radek knew because he'd been a boy in this house too. Hugo and Celia went through the kitchen, then the back corridor, then the stairs. Hugo had his weapon out. Celia did not have a weapon. She had 4 years of triage training and the specific knowledge of where in the human body a person can be stopped without being killed, and she thought that was going to have to be enough. Clement was in the nursery. He had Kira. The girl was held against him with one arm, a gun pressed to the side of her head, and Kira's face was the same expression Celia had seen in the parking garage, that particular terror that was worse for being utterly silent. But when Kira's eyes found Celia in the doorway, something else moved through them. It's over, Brandt, Clement said. His voice was unsteady. He had expected to be gone by now. This had already gone wrong. Hugo stepped forward slowly, voice quiet and even. Whatever they promised you, it won't hold. It never holds. You stopped listening to anyone 3 years ago, Clement said. I'm listening now. Celia watched Kira. The girl's eyes had not left her face. In 3 weeks they had built a language without words, nods and held gazes and small tilts of the head that carried entire sentences. Celia caught Kira's eyes and held them. She pressed one finger to her lips. Then she looked deliberately at the floor. She mouthed down. Kira understood. Her small body went completely limp, not thrashing but surrendering entirely to gravity, every kilogram of an 8-year-old dropping at once. Clement lurched, arm tightening to compensate, aim wavering for just a fraction of a second. Celia moved. She was not a sniper. She was a nurse who knew anatomy. She knew the shoulder. She knew the brachial plexus. She knew exactly what would make a man's arm stop receiving instruction from his brain. The gun Hugo had pressed into her hand in the hallway was heavier than she expected, and the crack of it in the small room was enormous, and Clement screamed and dropped everything he was holding. Run, Kira, Celia said. Kira scrambled across the floor. Hugo moved past Celia in one motion, and the rest of it was over in seconds. Celia caught Kira at the door and held on. Hugo came to them. He dropped to his knees and wrapped both arms around them, one around his daughter, one around Celia, and she felt the trembling in him that had no other place to go. She felt Kira's small hands fisted in the ruined gown. She felt the particular quality of a man who was undone and holding on. They stayed like that for a long time. And then, soft, hoarse, the sound of something that had been locked away for 18 months finally finding its key. A small voice said, very quietly, Celia. 2 syllables. Enormous. Hugo's arms went tighter. Celia closed her eyes. By April, the Rosedale garden had come back. The ranunculus had been replanted in the stone beds, and something small and determined was climbing the south wall. Kira had been out there twice a week with Mrs. Bellamy, pressing seeds into the earth with her thumbs, checking on them each morning with focused seriousness that made Celia's chest ache in the best possible way. Kira talked now, not to everyone, and not every day, and she still had stretches when the words felt too far away to reach. But she talked to Celia, she talked to Mrs. Bellamy, and she talked to her father, whose whole face changed when she did, a change so complete that the first time Celia witnessed it, she'd had to look away. It was a Tuesday afternoon in April sunshine when Hugo came and sat beside her on the garden bench. No suit jacket, just a wool sweater, and said, You're thinking about the contract. It expires in 2 months, Celia said. It does. She looked at him. In the months they'd lived inside each other's orbit, the careful distance that had slowly, stubbornly, become something else. She had learned his face the way she had learned anatomy. The way his jaw changed when he was worried about Kira. The way his mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile when she said something that surprised him. The way he looked at her, sometimes, when he thought she wasn't paying attention. "I think the terms need renegotiating," she said. He turned to look at her fully. "Name your conditions." "No expiry clause, steady. And I keep working. Not the R, I understand the security problems. But the community clinic in Cabbatown has been asking. I want that." She paused, "and Rex's tuition gets handled, without me having to ask again." "Done," Hugo said without hesitation. That was fast. "I've been waiting," he said quietly, "for the negotiation." He reached over and took her hand. His thumb moved across the platinum band. The ring she'd stopped noticing 3 months ago, the one that had become the ordinary weight of her finger. He didn't look at it. He looked at her. Down in the garden, Kira had given up explaining ladybugs to the new security man and was solemnly carrying one on her fingertip toward the ranunculus, murmuring something too quiet to hear. She glanced up at the bench, at the two of them, and gave the small private smile of a child who has decided that the shape of things is correct and is satisfied with the result. A nurse from Parkdale and the most careful man in this city, sitting in an April garden, while a little girl with a rabbit under her arm made her rounds. It was not the life Celia had calculated, but calculations, she had come to understand, were only useful for the things you could see coming, and some things arrived without warning in a parking garage in the dark, and changed everything before you had a moment to decide whether to let them.